All right, we're ready for Genesis 33 to 36 in our study tonight. And this is the outline we're following. That's quite simplistic, but just a reminder of where we are. We are in the section here that deals with the patriarchal history, and we're dealing with Jacob, point number 3 under the chosen family. All right, let's review some of our chapters. We won't notice every one of these, but chapter 1. Creation, 6 days of creation. Chapter 2, man in the garden. Chapter 3, Adam and Eve sinned. Very good. Chapter 4, Cain and Abel. All right, let's go to chapter 7. All right, the flood itself, yes. Chapter 10. All right, the nations from Noah's son. Chapter 12. All right, yeah, that deals with the promise. That's a very notable chapter. Not that any chapter is unimportant, but that's a notable chapter because of the promise. And it's going to be repeated again and again, as we're even seeing in our studies tonight. All right, chapter 14. Yeah, war among the kings. Chapter 16. Hagar and Ishmael, very good. All right, let's go to chapter 20. Yeah, Abimelech takes Sarah. Go to chapter 23. Deals with Sarah's death. All right, chapter 26. Isaac and Abimelech, very good. Chapter 28. Jacob's dream, very good. And then chapter 30. Yeah, Jacob's sons and their prosperity. And then last week, chapter 32. Yeah, he prepares to meet Esau. Remember, he's fleeing from Laban, and he prepares to meet Esau. I want us to go back to chapter 32 just for a moment because it sets the stage for our study tonight in chapter 33. In chapter 32, verses 1 to 21, Jacob prepares to meet Esau. Now, that's something we've already studied, but just a little review of what took place. As he's preparing, you'll remember that the text tells us that he sent messengers ahead, and he got word that Esau is coming with 400 messengers, or with 400, a band of 400. So what does he do to prepare? He sent something ahead. He sent gifts ahead. He sent two waves of gifts, and so they're going forth with the gifts, and then the next one group comes, and on down the line, actually a third that was mentioned in verse 19. And he asked what's going on, this is from Jacob your brother. He's sending this as a gift to you. All right, he made that preparation, and then we have Jacob wrestling with God. Now, Jacob is coming and fleeing from Padan Aram, which is up here in Haran, and Esau is down here at Edom, Mount Seir. We'll talk about Mount Seir in a moment. And so you have, I'm going to blow this up a little bit closer in a moment, but you have Esau coming up. They're going to meet right in this area, and we'll blow that up in just a moment. And Jacob is coming down, and Esau is coming up, and they're going to have this meeting that takes place in chapter 32. So to kind of give you perspective, Mount Seir is where the Edomites would dwell. This is where he's coming from, and he'll go back there, and we'll see more about Mount Seir a little bit later. All right, let's get verses 1 to 3 now. Jacob meets Esau. The first thing Jacob does before they come in contact, remember the gifts have gone ahead with his band of people going forth with the gifts to give Esau, to appease Esau. He doesn't know at this juncture how he's going to be received. Perhaps Esau is coming to meet him to take vengeance, but some time has passed, and we'll talk about that time here in just a moment. But be that as it may, he prepares, and so how does he prepare? By dividing his company. All right, yes. He puts the least in the front and the most valued, most loved one in the back. So he puts the two concubines in the front, the handmaids with their children, and then next Leah with her children, and then there is Rachel. She is the one that was favored, and Joseph. Now Benjamin hadn't been born yet, so Joseph and Rachel are in the back. But he goes ahead of them, and he crosses over and he bows himself down 7 times when he meets his brother. Now beginning at verse 4, Jacob finds favor. This is a little surprising to Jacob because he doesn't know but what there is still this anger and animosity. That's why he sent the gifts ahead. That's why he put the least favored people toward the front in case there is some problem. Now beginning at verse 4, Esau ran and embraced him and fell upon his neck and he kissed him and they wept. This was not the expected embrace that is not the greeting that Jacob was expecting. And then he saw the women and the children and asked, who are these? Now remember, it's been 20 years. You might make a marginal note if you don't have one. It's been 20 years. Go back to chapter 31 and in verse 41 that when he left Laban, he said, I've been here 20 years. He served for each one of his wives, 7 years each, so that makes 14, and then 6 years for the flock, making 20 years. So it's been 20 years that he's been up at Laban's place. And he went to Laban fleeing from his brother Esau. And so time has passed. He hadn't seen him in a while, and he hasn't seen these wives, nor any of their children. And there's a statement made at verse 5 that's very practical for family. What do you see at verse 5, just as a practical family lesson? These are children that God has graciously given to your servant. I don't think many Christians feel this way, but there are some who view children as a burden and children as a nuisance. Children are in their way of living their lives, but Jacob viewed these children as a gracious gift from God. And then the maidservants came, and then Leah came and bowed down before him. They're greeting him, and so now what does Esau say down through verse 11? Just paraphrase it. I don't need that. I have enough. I've been prospered. I have enough, so you keep that. But Jacob says, verse 10, it's like I've seen the face of God. In other words, I don't think he's saying Esau is like God. I think what he's saying, the reaction of the embrace that he gets, the welcome he gets from Esau was likened unto seeing the face of God. In other words, he rejoiced. I think that's all he's trying to say. That I believe this was a blessing from God. The way you treated me, the way I was embraced. And so please take the gift. And so he took it, verse 11. Now let's pick up at verse 12. Esau goes to Seir, and this gets a little interesting here at verses 12 to 17, and Jacob goes to Succoth. So let's see where we're talking about. This is blown up, a picture of what we just saw a moment. Jacob is coming from Haran area, and they meet right here. Now that place was mentioned. If you back up just a chapter or two, if I can get my pages unstuck. Back over in chapter 32 and in verse 2, Mahanaim is the place that is mentioned. This seems to be the place where they meet. And so here is Esau coming, and here's Jacob coming, and this is where they meet, right in the middle of that circle where you see the arrow. All right, now here is Succoth, and Esau is going to go back to Seir, and Jacob is going to go over here to Succoth. And we'll see what the significance of that is in just a moment. So, that's what I'm ready for. Let's go to beginning at verse 12. That Esau said, let us take our journey, let us go, and I will go before you. On a cursory reading of that, I read over that and I think, okay, I'm not sure what he's saying, but I think this is the point that he seems to be offering to go with Jacob and go kind of as a buffer or protection with Jacob. Jacob seemed to be a little disturbed about meeting Esau, And it seems like he's offering to go with Jacob, perhaps as protection. And he may be offering Jacob, there is some question if this is true, but he may be offering Jacob some land at Mount Seir. So let's read again verse 12. Let us make our journey, let us go, and I will go before you. In other words, let's take off and let's go and let's journey on. So let's go back to our map. He may be saying, let's take off and let's go back down here to the land of Edom. Let's go back to Mount Seir, and there's plenty of land there for us. Is that what he's saying? I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Could it also be that he's offering to go before him? Because if he lets Jacob go first, even though he's acted like everything is fine, if he lets Jacob go first, then he's sandwiched between Seir, where the other Edomites are, and Esau, and Jacob could be entrapped. So he may be trying to show him that I'm not trying to trap you or do anything. I'll go first, and then you come.
That may be. It may be that's what he's trying to do. Whatever the case, Jacob declines. And so students have speculated, why did he decline? I'm not sure. Some suggest that he may be concerned about competing for water with the number of people and the numbers of flocks. So he sent a number of flocks ahead. Jacob still has a great amount of flocks. Esau is going to have flocks back home with him. And so with all the amount of flocks, maybe there's a shortage, could be a shortage of water. I don't know that that's the case. It seems more that he's under direct divine direction to live in the land of Canaan. And we're going to see that more in chapter 35 in just a few moments. And that Mount Seir, if that's what the offer was, to go to Mount Seir, that's not in the land of Canaan. But let's go a little bit further. And we'll see something else at verse 14. What did Jacob say at verse 13? He declined, and one of the things he said was, you go on. Yeah. So we can't go at the pace you would need to go. And so Esau said, well, let me leave now, and some of the people who are with you. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in your sight. So Esau returned that day to Mount Seir. Now skip verse 14, not on purpose. He said, I'll lead on slowly, at a slow pace, and go before you. And Jacob said, I will go on slowly, etc., and are able to endure until I come to my Lord in Seir. That is, Jacob seems to be saying that you go ahead, go at your pace, I'm going to go at a slow pace, and until I come to Seir. Was he intending to go to Seir? And that's a question among students. If he intended to go there, there's no revelation that he ever made it. We have no record of his ever making it. Some suggest that he never intended to go, and that maybe someday I'll come, maybe someday I'll make it, maybe someday I'll visit you. That may be what he's saying. But you go on, and I'll go on at my pace and travel, and someday I'll be at Mount Seir. Did he go? I don't know. I don't know about the details of all of that. But several scholars make this observation, for what it's worth, that Jacob may be implying in that, you need to go your direction and I'll go mine, because we are entirely, and I know there's some conjecture, we are entirely different in our approach to life. We're entirely different in our outlook. We're entirely different. And you need to go to Mount Seir, and I may come someday to Mount Seir, but for now, I'm going to go my direction. Does that make sense? We all have that in our families. There are some family members you could live close to because of your common bond in the Lord, but there's some family members that they're better off to go their direction and you go your direction, and that's just the way it needs to be. Jacob and Esau are not the same people. Does that make sense? For whatever purpose, Jacob says, you go on, and so what happens? Well, verse 16, Esau returned that day to Seir. So he goes on and he goes back down here to Seir. And then Jacob goes where? To Succoth, and he built himself a house in booths. Your footnote will say concerning those booths are shelters for his animals, for his livestock, and therefore the name of the place was called Succoth, which means booths or shelters. So where is that? Well, they met here. he made his way over here to Succoth, right here, if you can see that in the middle of the circle. All right, he's going to go over to Shechem in just a moment, but that's where we leave him right now. Makes sense? They've parted ways. They've met. They've embraced. Esau wants them to travel together. Jacob says no, for whatever reason, and we can speculate. And they go their separate ways. And so Jacob, if he was intending to go Mount Seir, not immediately, he heads in another direction. He doesn't go to Mount Seir. And so was he lying about going to Mount Seir? I don't know that I don't see any evidence of that. It may be much like, someday I'll come. I'll come someday. Make sense? All right. Now let's go back to verses 18 to 20 to finish this chapter. Jacob goes to Shechem. So back up to our map here. Shechem is right over here. Here is Succoth. So this is where they met. And now they come over to Succoth, and he makes his way on over to Shechem. All right? So let's see what happens here. Jacob came safely to Shechem in the land of Canaan. He pitched a tent there, and he bought a parcel of ground from Hamor. Now, we see more about him in just a moment. Tells us how much money he gave for that. And he erected an altar there and called it El Elo Israel, meaning God, my God of Israel. And that's all we're told about his dwelling there. So what we accomplish in 18 to 20 is simply we get him over to Shechem, and there's going to be some disaster that takes place in the next chapter. All right, questions or comments on 33? And so I'm not going over the questions, but if in answer to question number 2, if you didn't have an answer, it was a peaceful, gracious embrace. They were weeping and exchanging of gifts and then parting ways. All right, let's go to 34. Now, there's a lot happening in chapter 34. This is a case of Shechem and Dinah. We're at the city of Shechem. There is a man named Shechem, one of the sons of Hamor, is named Shechem. And so what we begin to see in chapter 34 is a statement of the moral decline of Jacob's family. So we're going to see some of the moral decline. We see Dinah involved in a problem, and whether she was willing in that is a big question. We'll come to that in a moment, try to answer that. Then there is Simeon and Levi involved in the murder of innocent people. And then we're going to let's get ahead of ourselves to chapter 37. There's the brothers later are involved in, before we get that far, in chapter 35, there is Reuben who lays with his father's concubine. And then later in chapter 37, the mistreatment of their brother. So you see a statement of moral decline taking place in Jacob's sons, for what that may be worth to us. All right, let's talk about Shechem and Dinah now in chapter 34. Shechem lies with Dinah, verses 1 to 3. You might want to underline or highlight some words and learn a lesson about fornication and adultery. In fact, let's do that now, and then we'll come back and make some sense of this. At the end of verse 32, he violated her. Same word for defiled. In fact, some translations use the word defiled. Let's drop down to verse 5. He had defiled her. I'm reading from the New King James, so your words may be different. Verse 7, it was a disgraceful thing. And at the end of verse 7, it's a thing which ought not be done. All right, let's get ahead to verse 13. He defiled her. Drop down to verse 27. He defiled her. And verse 31, treated her as a harlot. Now, I'll go over those again as we flag them as we go along. Those are just a number of statements that describe this relationship outside of marriage, fornication, adultery, and he violated her, he defiled her, it was a disgraceful thing, it ought not be done. He defiled her, and treated her like a harlot. Not a pleasant picture. All right. Now let's see what happens here. This is Dinah, the only daughter of Leah, and she went out to see the daughters of the land. I gather from that some time has passed. and they're living in Shechem, that she's familiar with some of the people in the land and some of the women, and she goes out to visit with them. Now, did she do anything wrong? Well, some suggest the customs of the day, and others suggest no. So I'll leave it for you to decide for yourself. But some have suggested it was not in harmony with the customs of the land or of the Israelites either for a woman to go out by herself in the city without some accompaniment of her brother or someone with her. I'll leave you to decide that. I don't have any textual evidence to say that she did anything wrong, but she went out, and Shechem, the son of Hamor, saw her and took her and lay with her, which means he had sexual relationships with her, and he violated her. It means he defiled her, as some translations say. So now one of the questions is, was that rape or was it consensual? And so however many scholars you line up, you'll have about that many, divide them in about half, and you'll say, some will say it was rape, and some will say that it was consensual. What evidence is there that it was rape? Well, one of the evidences that it may be rape was that he seems to have at verse 26, we'll save our comments about verse 26 later, but they seem to be holding her captive. But that's also used as an argument to say it was probably consensual, because if he had raped her, that she would have escaped and would have run back home. We'll talk about that in verse 26. Verse 19 to me helps that the text indicates that Shechem was more honorable than the others in the family of his other brothers. And the text seems to indicate he was an honorable person. Now, that doesn't say he did right in laying with her, but that he probably wasn't a rapist. I take it that it was probably more consensual. You say it's rape, then have at it. I won't argue that. I'm just suggesting there's some evidence on both sides, and I lean more that it was probably consensual. And one of the evidences of that, to me, may be verse 26. Some have argued that the reason she was staying there is that she was ashamed to come back home. Had it been rape, she would have come back home. Is that 100% argument proof? No, it's not. I'm just throwing that out for you to chew on. All right, so he violated her. That doesn't, with the word within itself doesn't suggest whether it's rape or consensual. Now, let's go on down through verse 7. When he came to, and he spoke kindly to her, but he's wooing her. He's speaking romantically to her and trying to woo her. He goes to his father and says, "Get this woman for me for a wife." And when Jacob heard about it, he stayed quiet till the sons came in. And then Hamor comes to talk to Jacob and ask for her in marriage. Now, in verse 8 through 12, what happens? Hamor says before Jacob and her brothers, this was customary for the father to ask for a woman for his son, and he comes asking,
He wants them to intermarry and mingle amongst the people of the land and his people and do the exact opposite of what God commanded.
all right, yes, we want this woman for my son, Shechem. And we'll make a deal with you. You marry our daughters, and we'll marry your daughters. And there's plenty of, you can occupy the land, and we'll just be one people. And we'll see more about that in just a moment. That's the idea. And so the sons were very angry. Here's our word again. Verse 5 said he had defiled her. It was a disgraceful thing which ought not be done. Well, there's two problems here as to why it's such a disgraceful thing. Number one, it's outside the room of marriage. But equal to that was the fact that she was not among God's people. I mean, he was not. She is having a relationship with a man that was not among God's people. And that was a disgraceful thing. So there's two problems as to why that was disgraceful, and it's a thing that ought not be done. So now beginning at verse 8, Hamor now asked for this exchange in marriage, the text tells us, and make marriages with us and let us be one. And I want you to notice at verse, what am I looking for? Verse 12. Ask me, this is Shechem saying, ask me whatever dowry or gift may be, and I will give it to you. And, I lost my place, according to what you say, but give me the young woman as a wife. Now, there's something about, and then verse, let's see, verse, I think verse 11 and 12 makes the point. Verse 10 is the one I'm looking for. Let's trade together and we'll have possessions of yourselves among us. In other words, let's all dwell together. The thing I'm trying to drive home by pointing out verse 10 is this, that there is a danger that they're going to destroy their spirituality by this intermingling with the people. There's two dangers. They could destroy their spirituality by intermingling with the people of the land. We're going to see that more when the law comes into effect, Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 7. But there's a danger of them being absorbed into the Canaan culture. Does that make sense? So they intermingle with them. They start marrying. They're just going to be absorbed into this culture, and no longer are they going to be a special people through whom the Messiah is going to come. So there's danger in what's being proposed. Now to start at verse 13, what do the sons of Jacob say? I want to talk about their attitude first. Before we know what they say, on the surface it doesn't sound bad, but the text tells us what? They spoke deceitfully. They're scheming just like their daddy had done. They spoke deceitfully. Now they don't know that. That is, the sons of Hamor don't know that. Hamor and the sons don't know that just yet. They think it's on the up and up. But they spoke deceitfully because, and here's the reason, they had defiled, the reason being that they had defiled Dinah, their sister. Does that justify them being deceitful? No. Does that justify them killing? No. But that's the reason that's given. Now, what did they say? We can't do this. Look at verse 14. We can't do what you're asking because that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition, verse 15, every one of you is circumcised, and notice verse 16, and then we will be one people. There's your danger of being absorbed in the Canaanite culture. And they don't intend to be, but that's what they say to the sons of Hamor. We'll be one people. But if you'll be circumcised, and then you'll take our daughter, and if you don't want to be circumcised, we'll take our daughter, and we'll all be gone. We'll be out of here. So it's up to you. Now, beginning at verse 18, what was the reaction? Yeah, they said, sure, we'll do that. Notice at verse 19, I want to flag this again, that the young man did not delay to do the thing because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was more honorable than all the household of his father. He seemed to be an honorable man. That's one of my arguments, that this may have been consensual. I don't know. I don't know that it was rape, but be that as it may, I'll leave you to decide. So verse 21 through verse 24, they basically said, we'll do that. So Hamor goes to the gates of the city and announces to everybody, this is the conditions under which this takes place, and so let's all be circumcised, and they all go and they are circumcised. Now verse 25 beginning through verse 31, after they've been circumcised, 3 days into that, when they were in pain, this was their design, this was their plan. They are taking advantage when these men couldn't fight. What two men take the lead? Simeon and Levi. Dinah's brothers, they each took a sword and they killed all the males. Now let's stop and talk about the influence of the culture here. I think they've already been heavily influenced by Canaanite culture. What evidence? By that very action. Yeah, they're killing innocent people. And not only did they kill the innocent people, notice what they did. They took all the wealth, verse 29, and all their little ones, that's children, and wives. So they kill all the men and they take their children and their wives. That's part of the Canaanite culture. They're acting like the Canaanites. And they did that because their sister had been, verse 27, defiled. Now I want to go back to verse 26 and comment about verse 26. I said we'd come back to that. So let's go. Look at verse 26. They killed Hamor and Shechem with the edge of the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house. Now up to this point, we don't know that. We haven't seen any evidence that she was held captive. So some argue that she may have been held captive against her will. Evidence that she was raped and then she was taken off. Maybe. Others argue that she was ashamed to go back home because she willingly consented and was afraid to go back home, so she willingly stays with Shechem. Which was it? I don't know. I'll leave that for you to decide. But that's new information that we hadn't seen up to this point, that she was being held captive, or at least staying there, and they go in and they rescue her and they take her out and take her home. All right. Now, what is the reaction of Jacob, verse 30? Yeah, you've made me obnoxious among the inhabitants. In other words, we're strangers in the land. Even though we've been here a while, we're still strangers in the land. We're not Canaanites. We are God's people, and here we are, and look what y'all have done in creating a problem for us. We're going to have to leave. We can't stay here. Evidence of that, chapter 35. Their reaction, verse 31, shows a little friction between Jacob's sons and perhaps their lack of respect for their father. And that's going to be evident in chapter 37, by the way, when they lie about his son. What do you see in verse 31? Seems like they are chiding and rebuking and scolding their father. Yeah, giving themselves an excuse. Should he treat our sister like a harlot? In other words, this may be that we've created a problem for you, Dad, and for us staying in the area. That may be. But our sister was treated like a harlot, and we're not going to tolerate that. It seems to me to imply that Jacob, Daddy, you would tolerate, and you did tolerate, but we took care of the business. Like should have been, like you perhaps should have. And we took care of it. I don't know, maybe it didn't, but I think they seem to be scolding him a little bit and perhaps being a little disrespectful to him. But be that as it may, they thought she was being treated like a harlot. All right, questions on 34. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
And they were not God's people. They had their own idols, they had their own ways. And those things are when the children were young and being raised through that, and it affected them. Even if Jacob came out into the land that God had promised him and was living there, they still, when they were young, had that effect. That's a lesson we need for ourselves and our children.
Good point.
What we're doing with it when they're young.
Good point. They had the influence of idolatry in their youth, and now they're in the midst of a Canaanite culture. And there's going to be some problems that grow out of that. Questions or comments on 34? Let's go to 35. We're going to spend most of our time in 35 and quickly hit 36 for obvious reasons if you've read ahead. So let's go with 35. Jacob is at Bethel and the death of Rachel and Isaac. So Jacob returns to and builds an altar at Bethel. This is verses 1 to 15. All right, let's find Bethel here. Right here is Shechem, is where all this disaster took place. Bethel is right down here in the middle of my circle, as you can see. And that's where this is taking place. Now, let's get what's going on in verses 1 to 15. I take it from the close of chapter 34 that Jacob is saying, in essence, and I'm paraphrasing, and maybe putting two and two together and making six. I got that. But it seems like Jacob is saying, we're going to have to leave. We can't stick around here because what you sons have done and the problem you created. And God, knowing that, tells him, arise and go to Bethel. And so he does. And the same place where you were when you were fleeing from the face of your brother Esau. Now, at verse 2, when they get ready to do that, what does Jacob say to his sons? Got to get rid of your idols, cleanse yourself, and change your garments. And so what's the significance of changing garments? I don't know for sure. Some suggest it was similar to going in to the temple, and so the cleansing was representative of an inner cleansing. I take it that go to the extreme, go to whatever measures it takes to rid yourself of the influence of sin. And so get rid of your idols. And in other words, we're making a new start, and we're going to leave our idolatry and our sin behind us. And so he said, then let us arise and let us go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress. That's when he's fleeing from his brother Esau in chapter 28. That's what he's talking about. And so they brought their idols, their foreign gods, to Jacob, and he buried them. And they took off on their journey, and he came to Luz, which is Bethel, verse 6. And he built an altar there, and he called the name of the place, unique name, El Bethel, which means, the house of God. God of the house of God is what that expression means. So at verse 8 or verse 7, he built a place there because God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. You might make a marginal note if you don't have center reference column notes. Genesis 28:13 is where that took place. Now, Deborah, Rachel's nurse, died and was buried. We haven't seen Deborah, or have we? Well, yeah, we have. We just didn't see her name. So go back to chapter 24 if you want to make a note. Connecting note. I like doing that in my text. So go back to chapter 24 and in verse 59, that when Rebekah, he sent away Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse. She's not identified by name. Might make a marginal note, her name is Deborah. And I know that from chapter 35 and verse 8. So go back to 35 and verse 8 and make your reference back to 24 and 59. So that's her nurse. We saw her earlier, we just didn't know her name. All right? She died, and she was buried. Then God appeared to Jacob again. And so what do we have in verses 9 through 15? What we have is the reaffirmation of the promise that God had made to Abraham, to Isaac, and already made to Jacob, and he's reaffirming that promise. So you might circle a couple of words here. You see at verse 11, he would multiply and make a great nation out of him. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you. So here is the nation promise. And here in verse 12 is the land promise. Might circle the word land. The seed promise, I think, is implied, though the seed is not specifically mentioned in this context. And so Jacob called on the name of the Lord. I know we missed some things in that in interest of time, but Jacob returns to Bethel. He makes an altar to God, and God reaffirms the promise. This is the land, and I'm going to build a nation out of you. So this is where you need to be. It's where I want you to be. I'm giving you this land, and I'm making a great nation out of your descendants. Same promise of Genesis 12. All right. Now then, let's start at verse 16, and we have Rachel dies and the birth of Benjamin. So they make their way from Bethel to Ephrath, which is the same place as Bethlehem. All right? Do I have that on the map? Yes. So they go from Bethel down here to Bethlehem. And she is in great labor pains, and she wanted to call her son. She died in giving birth, verse 18. She wanted to call him Ben-Ani, and which simply means, according to your footnote, son of my sorrow, but Jacob wanted to name him Benjamin, which is the son of my right hand. So we've been listing the sons of Jacob, and where we did that earlier, we numbered them, at least suggested you number them out to the side in the margin of your text. And we jumped over, and if you don't already have it, you might put a 12 here. This is the 12th son. This is the last of the sons of Jacob. Make sense? So now we have the 12 sons. We have the birth of all of them right here. All right. So now, I want you to notice at verse 22, that it happened that when Israel dwelt in the land, that Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. Now, there's going to be a reaction to that a little bit later. And 2 points I want to make about that. Why did he do that, and why is that mentioned here? I don't think it's one of those, oh, by the way, here's another little interesting tidbit. Quite often, and I'm not going to take the time to trace that, when a man would go into his father's concubines, particularly if it was a king, that if you went into the father's concubines, David's sons did this, that's an effort to take over authority and reign. And perhaps him being the oldest, Reuben being the oldest, it very well may be that it was an effort for him to take rulership in the family. Do we know that? No. But it's interesting that on the death of Rachel, that he immediately then, on the death of Rachel, goes into one of the concubines. And perhaps he's thinking maybe of some sense of rulership. Let's go over to chapter 49 just quickly. Genesis 49, verses 2 to 4. You might make a marginal reference. And the point being made here, Jacob later rebukes him and mentions, as he gives his last words to his son, that you're unstable and you will not excel at verse 4, because you went into your father's bed and you defiled and you went up to my couch. So you're not going to excel because of what you did. The rebuke is not found in our text, but it's found later in chapter 49. So make a marginal note, chapter 49, verses 2 to 4. All right? Then the next section is Jacob's 12 sons. All 12 are mentioned. We're not going to take the time to go through every one of those. And then you have the death of Isaac. How old was he? 180 years, and he died, and they buried him at Hebron. And so we have him dying at Hebron. Now let's go to chapter 36 now. By the way, this is down here. So they've been making their way from Shechem down to Bethel, and then Benjamin was born at Bethlehem, and then this is where at Mamre near Hebron is where Isaac passes. Make sense? All right. Now let's go to 36. We don't have but a couple of minutes, and that's all it's going to really take, because it's not that this is unimportant, but this is a chapter, and let's get the purpose and the point of the chapter. This is about Esau. This is typical of the style of writing of Genesis. There are secondary family members like Ishmael, where information is given, but that's not the predominant story. Esau, secondary. Jacob is the mainline story. Make sense? So we're going to pick back up with Jacob in chapter 37. Well, what about Esau? Well, this is the family of Esau, and they moved to Mount Seir. That's down in the land of Edom that we've already talked about. So here's the point of the chapter. It shows God's promise to Esau in chapter 27, verses 39 and 40, was fulfilled. It shows that God's promise to Esau in chapter 27, 39 and 40 was fulfilled. God blessed them even though they were not the predominant nation, not God's favored nation. They would be prosperous and they would grow, their descendants would grow. That's the point of the chapter. So why all the details? Well, the details gives validity to that, rather than they grew and they became a great nation. Well, how great did they become? Well, look at all the chiefs and the kings, etc. Does that make sense? So you say, well, that's kind of boring. That's not the point. The point is the details gives validity to that. Does that make sense to you? So what we have here are 3 wives that are mentioned. So here is Esau, And here are the 3 wives that are mentioned, these 3 women right here, and the 5 sons that they have, and then their descendants. And so I'm not going to go through all those names. We don't have time. Next week, none of us will remember those names anyway. It's not that it's unimportant, but the details of that do what? Gives validity to that. All right. So you have 3 wives and you have 5 sons. And so you have, I want to point out one other thing and we're going to quit. After listing all the kings and their chiefs, I want you to notice the end of chapter 36 and the beginning of 37. Some think verse 1 of 37 should go with the previous section. And so I just want to mention that having mentioned Esau, they go to Mount Seir. Now Jacob, chapter 37:1, dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. So what's the storyline? They prospered, they did well, but they're over here. We're going to come back to them later. Let's now talk about Jacob. Does that make sense? That's the storyline. Secondary family, primary family. We're going to stop on that note.